You ever unlock a door that shouldn't exist and still hear it click open like it's been waiting for you? The wood groaned under my hand before I even turned the knob, that dry, splintered creak echoing across a lake I hadn't seen in 14 months. And when the door swung inward, the smell hit me first. Fresh pine, varnish, money. None of it mine. None of it supposed to be here. Not on my land. Not on the same stretch of shoreline where my father taught me how to cast a line at 6 years old. Not on the water that still carried the memory of the storm that took him. And yet there I was, standing inside a fully furnished luxury cabin, keys in my hand that I never cut, staring at floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked a lake I owned on paper but didn't recognize anymore, because where there used to be quiet, just wind brushing over 2 acres of open water and the low hum of cicadas, there were now 17 identical cabins lined up like they'd been stamped out of a catalog, each one with its own dock, each one with lights reflecting across the surface like someone had turned my family's land into a postcard for strangers. And the gravel crunched behind me before I even had time to process it. That tight, controlled rhythm of someone who believed they belonged here. And I didn't have to turn around to know exactly who it was, because I'd already seen the white SUV parked halfway up the new paved drive that used to be a dirt path my grandfather carved out in 1968, back when this place was just raw land and stubborn work. And her voice came smooth, polished, like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. "You found one of our premium units," she said, like she was giving me a tour, like I hadn't just stepped into something that didn't legally exist. And I finally turned, letting the lake sit behind me, letting the reflection of those cabins burn into my eyes. And there she was, Victoria Hargrove, HOA president, dressed like she owned every square inch in sight. Sunglasses catching the afternoon light, posture straight, not a hint of hesitation, because to her, this wasn't theft. It was improvement, and I could still taste the jet fuel from the last flight home. Sitting in the back of my throat, still feel the stiffness in my shoulders from sleeping upright across 2 continents. And now I was being told my land had been improved while I was gone, improved into something that charged $450 a night per cabin according to the sign I passed at the entrance, a sign bolted into the ground where my old fence post used to stand. And I let my fingers tighten around that key just enough to feel the edge bite into my skin. Not pain, just pressure, something real, something grounding, because everything else fell off by inches, like the world had shifted while I was away and no one bothered to tell me. And she stepped closer, heels crunching against gravel that hadn't existed a year ago, and said it again, slower this time, like I might have missed it. "We turned it into a community asset." And that word, community, hung in the air heavier than it should have, because there was no community here when my family paid the taxes, no community when my father stood waist-deep in freezing water fixing that old dock after every storm, and definitely no community on the deed sitting in my glove box with my name printed across the bottom. And that's when I noticed it, just past the line of cabins, half hidden between 2 new docks, the original one. Our dock, weathered wood, slightly crooked, still anchored exactly where it had always been, untouched, like a piece of the past they didn't know how to erase. And something in my chest shifted, slow and quiet. Not anger, not yet, something colder, something patient. Because if they missed that, if they left even one thing exactly where it was supposed to be, then they didn't just build on my land, they built on my proof. I did not argue with her, not right away, because arguing would mean I accepted her version of reality. And I could already tell she had practiced that version enough to believe it herself. So instead I stepped past her, out of the cabin, letting the screen door snap shut behind me with that hollow, cheap sound that did not belong anywhere near my lake. And the air outside felt different too, heavier somehow, carrying the faint smell of charcoal grills and synthetic citrus cleaner. The kind they use in short-term rentals to make everything feel the same no matter where you are. And I walked down the line of cabins slow, deliberate, counting them under my breath without moving my lips. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 17, each one spaced exactly 12 feet apart like someone had measured it with a laser, each one sitting just far enough off the water to look compliant, to look legal, to look like they had permission. And every few steps there were little details that stuck out like splinters, security cameras mounted under eaves, rental lockboxes bolted next to doors, laminated welcome sheets taped inside windows, with Wi-Fi passwords and checkout instructions. All of it temporary. All of it designed for turnover, not ownership, not legacy, not the kind of permanence my family built here over 50 years. And I could hear her heels following me, steady, confident, not trying to stop me, because in her mind there was nothing to stop. This was hers now. Or at least that is what she wanted me to think. And when I reached the midpoint, I stopped. Not because of the cabins, but because of the water, because the way the light hit the surface told me something had changed. The reflection line was off by a few feet, subtle, almost invisible unless you had grown up watching it every summer. And I felt that same quiet shift again in my chest, that slow, methodical awareness clicking into place. Because land can be faked, structures can be staged, but water does not lie about boundaries, and I turned just enough to glance back at her, keeping my voice level, almost casual. When did construction start? I asked, and she smiled like she had been waiting for that question, like it was her favorite part of the story. About 8 months ago, she said, brushing an invisible speck off her sleeve. The community voted unanimously. We secured all the proper permits. Everything was done by the book. And there it was, the phrase people hide behind, when they do not expect anyone to read the book. And I nodded once, slow, like I was accepting it, like I was processing defeat. And she mistook that silence for agreement, stepping closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable. Look, Ethan, you have been gone a long time. Properties like this cannot just sit unused. We had to think about the neighborhood, about value, about safety, she said, standing on land where my father once tied a rope to that old dock during a storm so it would not drift. And I let my gaze drift past her shoulder, back to that same dock, still there, still anchored, its warped planks catching the light differently than everything around it. And I could almost feel the measurements in my head lining up, distance from shore, angle to the tree line. The exact point where the original survey marker used to sit before someone decided it was inconvenient. And I took a slow breath, tasting the lake water in the air, grounding myself in something that had not changed. Because that was the difference between us. She saw development. I saw data. She saw cabins. I saw coordinates. And if she was right, then everything she built would stand. But if she was wrong, even by a foot, even by an inch, then every single one of these structures was not just out of place. They were sitting exactly where they should not be. And I slipped the key back into my pocket, letting the metal settle against my palm like a promise I had not spoken yet, because she thought I had just arrived to see what she had done. But the truth was, I was already starting to see how she made her first mistake. I let her keep talking behind me. Something about community bylaws and shared development benefits, her voice smoothing over every sharp edge like she believed repetition could make it true. But I had already tuned it out, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And every step I took along that shoreline was feeding me pieces of something she did not even realize she had left exposed. The slope of the land, the spacing of the docks, the way the waterline kissed the support posts. Just a little too high on some, and just a little too low on others. Subtle shifts that would mean nothing to anyone else, but to me felt like reading a blueprint drawn in reflections and shadows. And when I reached the old dock again, I stepped onto it. Without asking, the wood flexing under my weight in that familiar way that instantly cut through 14 months of distance. And for a second, everything else fell quiet. No voices, no cabins, just the soft slap of water against the posts and the distant hum of a boat somewhere across the lake. And I crouched down, running my hand along the edge where the original survey plate used to be bolted, feeling the faint outline where metal once sat. And it was still there, not the plate itself, but the indentation, the exact position burned into the wood like a fingerprint. And I closed my eyes just long enough to picture it. The coordinates stamped into that plate. Numbers I had memorized years ago when my father made me recite them like they mattered. Because they did. Because that single point defined everything that came after it. Every boundary line, every measurement, every legal claim. And when I stood back up, I did not rush. I did not react. I just looked out across the cabins. Again, but this time I was not seeing them as structures. I was mapping them, plotting invisible lines from that dock outward, measuring angles in my head the same way I had done on job sites across 3 countries. And it did not take long, maybe 10 seconds, maybe less, before the realization settled in, slow and precise, like a lock turning into place, They did not just build close to the boundary. They crossed it, not by a lot, not in a way that would catch the eye of someone skimming paperwork, but enough. Enough that at least half those cabins were not sitting on what they thought was community land. They were sitting on mine, and the rest, the ones further back, depended on access points that ran directly through my property line, which meant even the ones technically outside it were not as independent as they looked, and I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift from uncertainty into clarity, because that was the difference between a mistake and a liability, and they had just crossed into the second one without realizing it. And behind me, her voice finally cut sharper, a hint of impatience slipping through that polished tone. "You are trespassing on private community property," she said, each word more deliberate than the last, and I turned just enough to face her, keeping my expression neutral, almost bored, like none of this mattered yet, because in a way it did not until I had everything I needed. "I just wanted to see what you built," I said, simple, flat, giving her nothing to push against, and that seemed to satisfy her, or at least convince her she was still in control, because she straightened slightly, adjusting her stance like she had reasserted authority, and I stepped off the dock, brushing my hand against the railing one last time, anchoring that position in my mind, because that dock was not just a memory anymore. It was a reference point, a fixed truth in a layout full of assumptions. And as I walked back toward my truck, gravel crunching under boots that still carried dust from another continent, I could feel the plan forming without needing to force it, piece by piece, quiet, patient, because this was not about confrontation. Not yet. This was about documentation, about letting them believe their version of reality just a little longer while I built mine on something that would hold up under scrutiny. And when I reached the door, I paused just long enough to glance back at the lake one more time, at the cabins glowing in the late afternoon light. Perfect, expensive, completely out of place, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt something close to calm, because they thought they had taken something from me. But standing there with that shoreline mapped in my head, I realized they had actually given me something far more valuable. They had given me proof. I did not drive straight home, not yet, because rushing would mean reacting, and reacting was exactly what they expected from someone who had just found their land turned into a postcard rental business. So instead, I took the long way around the county road, letting the tires hum against asphalt that used to be gravel when I was a kid, watching how the trees thinned out near the east side where the original property line curved inward just slightly, a detail most people would never notice, unless they had walked it 100 times with a measuring tape, and a stubborn old man who believed land was something you learned with your feet, not just paper. And by the time I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, the sun was already dipping low enough to throw long shadows across the steps, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it is. But inside, nothing had changed. Same fluorescent buzz, same smell of paper and dust, and old air conditioning, and I moved through it without hesitation, boots echoing against tile as I headed straight for the records office, because this was where stories got corrected, where assumptions either held up or fell apart under ink and signatures. And the woman behind the counter barely looked up when I asked for archived plats on my parcel, just pointed me toward a row of cabinets like she had done it 1,000 times. And maybe she had, but not for this, not for what I was about to confirm. And the drawer slid open with that heavy metallic scrape, revealing stacks of folded maps and documents that felt thicker than they should have been, each one holding a version of the truth that someone had relied on at some point. And I started with the oldest one I knew mattered, the original survey tied to that dock, the one my father made me memorize. And when I unfolded it, the paper cracked slightly at the edges, but the lines were still sharp, clean, deliberate, showing boundaries that did not care about what had been built later, only what was established first. And I traced it with my finger, following the shoreline curve until it hit that exact coordinate burned into my memory. And there it was, unchanged, anchored, a fixed point in a system that depended on consistency. And then I pulled the newer documents, the ones filed in the last year, zoning adjustments, development permits, HOA filings, all stamped and approved with the confidence of people who believed they had done everything right. And at first glance it looked clean, organized, professional, but that was the thing about clean paperwork. It only takes one overlooked detail to unravel it. And I laid them side by side, old against new, letting the differences speak for themselves. And it did not take long, not with the Shoreline drawn twice in two slightly different ways, not with the angle of that east curve softened just enough to shift the boundary a few feet inland on paper, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper, because that was not an accident. That was an assumption. Someone had redrawn the line to fit the development, not the other way around. And they got it approved because no one checked it against the original anchor point. No one went back to that dock, to that plate, to that exact coordinate that had been there longer than any of these cabins would ever stand. And I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of that sink in, because this was no longer a question of whether they crossed the line. It was how far, and more importantly, how provable it was. And the answer sat right there in front of me, stamped, dated, signed, a perfect chain of documents leading to a single flaw, and I could almost hear her voice again, talking about doing everything by the book, and she was right. They did. They followed the book they were given. They just never realized the book itself had been built on a page that did not match the original. And I folded the documents carefully, not rushing, because precision matters when you are about to challenge something this big. And as I carried them to the counter to request certified copies, the woman finally looked up, asking for a name to attach to the file. And I gave it without hesitation, steady, clear, because for the first time since I stepped onto that shoreline, this was no longer just about what I saw. It was about what I could prove, and proof, unlike cabins or permits or polite smiles, does not shift when someone wants it to. And as I walked back out into the fading light, papers in hand, I knew exactly what came next. Not confrontation, not yet, something quieter, something slower, because they were still building their version of reality, still renting those cabins, still collecting money on something they thought they owned. And the longer they did that, the deeper they stepped into a position they could not walk back from. And I was going to let them, because sometimes the strongest move is not stopping someone. When they make a mistake, it is letting them finish it completely. I did not hire a lawyer the next day, and that was the part most people would not understand, because when something gets taken from you, the instinct is to fight back immediately, to make noise, to push, to demand answers. But standing there with certified copies in my passenger seat, I knew this was not a situation you rush. This was a situation you let breathe. You let it expand just enough that it becomes impossible for the other side to shrink it back down. And the next morning I parked across the street from the entrance they had built, engine off, window cracked just enough to let the air carry the sound of rolling suitcases over gravel, the low hum of vacation chatter, doors opening and closing in a rhythm that told me everything I needed to know about occupancy. They were not just finished, they were operational, fully booked, and that mattered more than any blueprint or permit ever could, because it meant revenue. It meant transactions. It meant a paper trail that tied those structures directly to financial gain. And I sat there longer than I needed to, watching patterns, counting cars, noting license plates from out of state, Texas, Illinois, even one from Oregon, all of them parked on land that was never supposed to be part of any community development. And every time someone stepped out with a key code or scanned a lockbox, I could see the system working exactly as intended, just not on the land they thought they were standing on. And when I finally stepped out of the truck, I did not walk toward the cabins. I walked toward the small wooden sign near the entrance, the one advertising nightly rates and contact information, and I took my time reading it like a guest would, noting the company name, the management group, the phone number printed in clean, bold font, because those details mattered. Those were connections, and connections create accountability. And I pulled out my phone, not to call, not yet, just to take a picture, clean, centered, making sure every letter was visible, because this was not about memory, this was about record. And by the time I was done, I had a quiet collection of evidence that told a very simple story. They built, they listed, they rented, they profited, all on land tied to a boundary they had shifted without verifying. And I drove from there to the county tax office, a place most people only visit when they have to, but I walked in like I belonged there, because in a way I did. And the clerk behind the desk recognized my last name before I even finished speaking, a small town habit that never really goes away. And when I asked about recent property tax filings associated with the Lakefront development, she pulled them up without hesitation, turning the screen slightly so I could see. And there it was again, that same adjusted boundary line, that same quiet shift, but now attached to assessed values, to commercial classifications, to numbers that reflected a business, not just structures, and I asked for copies, keeping my voice steady, neutral, like this was routine, and she printed them out with the same casual rhythm, unaware that each page added weight to something that was already starting to lean in my favor. And when I stepped back outside, the sun was higher, the day moving forward like nothing unusual had happened. And that was the point. Nothing looked wrong on the surface. Everything appeared organized, permitted, even profitable. And that illusion was exactly what made it so fragile, because it depended entirely on a version of reality that could not hold up once someone anchored it back to the original truth. And I sat in my truck again, papers stacked neatly beside me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think a step ahead, not just about proving the boundary, but about what happens after that. Because if even one of those cabins crossed into my land, then the question was not just about removal. It was about ownership, about control, about who had the right to what had already been built. And I let that thought settle without forcing it, because rushing it would cheapen it. And this was not something you guess at. This was something you build carefully, piece by piece, until the conclusion becomes unavoidable. And as I started the engine, the low rumble grounding me in the moment, I realized something that made me pause for just a second longer than usual. They thought they were making money off my land. But if I played this right, they were actually building something far more valuable for me, something they would not be able to take back once it was finished. I waited 3 days before making the first move that actually mattered, not because I needed more proof, but because timing changes how proof is received. And on the third morning, the lake was busier than I had ever seen it. Kayaks cutting across the water, families unloading coolers, rental guests treating the shoreline like it had always belonged to them. And I parked in the same spot as before, engine off, watching how easily people accept what looks permanent, because that is the real advantage of a structure. Once it stands long enough, it starts to feel legitimate. And that illusion was exactly what I needed, fully intact before I stepped in, and I reached into the passenger seat, pulling out the folder I had been building, each document stacked in order: original survey, updated plat, tax records, permit filings, all of it clean, all of it simple, no guesswork, no emotion, just facts aligned in a way that told a story no one in that HOA office was ready to hear yet. And instead of walking toward the cabins, I drove straight to the one place that sits above all of this, the county surveyor's office, a small building that most people forget exists until something goes wrong. And inside it smelled like ink and dust and quiet authority, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. And I placed the documents down on the counter one by one, not rushing, letting each page land flat, visible. And when the surveyor stepped over, an older man with reading glasses hanging low and the kind of patience that comes from decades of correcting other people's mistakes, he did not say much at first, just started looking, tracing lines with his finger, comparing coordinates without me needing to explain anything. Because good professionals do not need a speech, they need data. And the longer he looked, the more his expression shifted, not dramatic, just subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a pause that lasted half a second longer than normal. And that was enough for me to know exactly where this was going. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "Where did you say these cabins were built?" And I gave him the location, steady, clear, and he leaned back slightly, glancing between the original survey and the revised plat like he was confirming something he already suspected. And then he said it, not loud, not dramatic, just matter of fact: "These lines do not match." And that was the moment everything clicked into something official, something outside of my own observation. Because it is one thing to know the truth, it is another to have it recognized by the system that enforces it. And he pulled out his own tools, overlays, mapping software, layers that showed elevation and boundary markers. And within minutes, the screen displayed exactly what I had mapped in my head days earlier. Only now it was precise, digital, undeniable. The cabins were not just close to the boundary, they were over it. Several feet in some cases, enough to matter, enough to change ownership implications, and more importantly, the access road and utility lines feeding those cabins crossed through my property line entirely, which meant even the structures that sat outside the boundary depended on land they did not legally control. And he looked at me again, this time with a different tone, less neutral, more direct. "If this holds, they have a problem." And I nodded once, because I already knew that. but hearing it said out loud carried weight, and he asked if I wanted to file a formal boundary review, and I did not hesitate, not because I was eager, but because this was the step that turned everything from preparation into motion. And as he started the paperwork, typing slowly, methodically, entering coordinates that had been sitting in my memory for years, I stood there without saying much, letting the process unfold, because once this was filed, it would trigger notices, reviews, inspections, all the things that force people to confront what they built on. And I could almost picture Victoria standing in that same confident posture, explaining how everything was done by the book, only to have the book rewritten in front of her, line by line, with data she never thought to check. And when I signed the final page, pen pressing firmly into paper, I felt that same calm settle in again, deeper this time, because this was no longer just a plan. It was a process already in motion, and processes like this do not stop halfway. They carry through to a conclusion, whether someone likes it or not. And as I walked back out into the daylight, folder lighter in my hand, but far heavier in meaning, I realized something simple that made me pause just long enough to look back at the building. They were still renting those cabins, still collecting money, still acting like nothing was wrong. But now every single day they did that. They were not just operating a business, they were building a case against themselves, and all I had to do was let it finish. The notice did not arrive with sirens or raised voices. It came folded in a standard county envelope, stamped and dated like every other piece of official mail that most people open without thinking. But I knew exactly what it was the moment I saw the return address, and I watched from across the lake as the delivery truck rolled slowly down the newly paved road, stopping at each cabin, each unit that had been booked solid for weeks. And one by one those envelopes were dropped into identical metal boxes that had never been there a year ago. And for a moment nothing changed. Guests still walked out with coffee mugs. Kids still ran down toward the water. Kayaks still scraped lightly against docks that were not supposed to exist. And that was the strange part about consequences. They do not always announce themselves right away. Sometimes they sit quietly until someone reads them. And I saw it happen near the third cabin from the west side. A man in a baseball cap stepping out, flipping through his mail casually before his posture shifted just slightly, shoulders tightening, head tilting as he read the first page again, slower this time. And within minutes there were more of them, doors opening, people comparing papers, confusion moving across that row of cabins like a ripple. And I stayed where I was, leaning against my truck, letting distance do its job, because this was not something I needed to be present for. This was something the system handled on its own once it had the right information, and by midday the pattern had changed completely. Fewer people on the water, more standing in small clusters, phones pressed to ears, voices lower, sharper, not angry yet, just uncertain. Because the notice did not accuse, it clarified. It stated that a formal boundary review was in progress, that certain structures may be subject to jurisdictional reassessment, that continued commercial activity could carry liability pending final determination. Clean language, careful language, the kind that makes people realize they might be standing somewhere they should not be. And I could almost hear Victoria's voice in my head as she tried to explain it away, tried to frame it as routine, as temporary. But the problem with routine explanations is they fall apart when too many people start asking the same question at once. And by late afternoon, I saw her SUV pull in fast, not reckless, but faster than someone who believed everything was under control, and she stepped out with that same polished posture, sunglasses in place, walking straight toward the cluster of guests near the central dock, her movements precise, practiced, like she had handled complaints before. But this was different. This was not a noise issue or a parking dispute. This was something that did not resolve with a friendly tone and a printed policy. And even from where I stood, I could see the shift. The way she held the paper just a second longer than necessary. The way her head turned slightly toward the shoreline, toward that old dock she had ignored days ago. And that was when it registered. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to disrupt the certainty she had been carrying. And I pushed myself off the truck slowly, not walking toward her, just changing position, letting her see me without approaching. Because presence matters at moments like this, not confrontation, just visibility. And when her gaze finally locked onto mine across the distance, there was a flicker there. Brief, controlled, but real, the first crack in something that had been built on assumption instead of verification. And I did not smile. I did not gesture. I just stood there, steady, letting the situation speak for itself, because this was no longer about convincing anyone. This was about letting the process unfold in a way that could not be argued away. And as the sun started to dip again, casting long reflections across cabins that suddenly felt less permanent than they had that morning, I realized something that settled in deeper than anything before it. They were starting to understand that something was wrong, but they still did not understand how wrong it was. And that gap between awareness and realization, that space where people think they can still fix things quickly, that was exactly where the outcome becomes unavoidable, because by the time they catch up to the full picture, it is already too late to change it. The meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning, posted quietly on the county bulletin like any other procedural review, but by 8:45 the parking lot was already filling up with cars that did not belong to regulars, polished SUVs, rental trucks, even a few of the same out-of-state plates I had seen parked by the cabins just days earlier, and I stayed inside my truck for a moment longer than necessary, watching how people gathered near the entrance in small groups, papers in hand, voices low but urgent, because once uncertainty turns into paperwork, it becomes something people cannot ignore. And when I finally stepped out, the air carried that same mix of dust and tension that you only notice when something important is about to shift. And inside the room, it was all clean lines and neutral tones, rows of chairs facing a long table where county officials were already setting up documents, laptops open, maps rolled out and held flat with metal weights. And I took a seat, near the back, not hiding, just observing, because this was not a moment for speeches, this was a moment for structure. And when Victoria walked in, she did not hesitate. She moved straight to the front like she always had, posture straight, expression controlled. But there was something different now, something tighter around the edges, like she had already spent the last 24 hours trying to solve a problem that would not stay contained. And the surveyor I met earlier stood up first, no theatrics, no raised voice, just a calm introduction of the review process, explaining how discrepancies between recorded plats and original survey data had triggered a formal reassessment. And then he turned the monitor outward, rotating it just enough for the room to see. And that was when the lines appeared, layered over each other in precise contrast. The original boundary drawn in solid black, the revised one in a softer blue, and the difference between them was not dramatic at a glance, just a subtle shift along the shoreline. A few feet here, a slight angle there. But when he zoomed in, when he isolated the section where the cabins stood, the overlap became undeniable. Structures that had been marketed as premium lakefront units now clearly crossing into land they were never permitted to occupy, and the room went quiet in that specific way it does when people realize something is not just wrong, it is provably wrong. And Victoria stepped forward, voice steady but sharper than before, asking about permit approvals, about the authority of submitted plats, and the response came just as measured. Permits are valid only within accurate boundaries, and inaccurate boundaries do not hold once corrected, and you could see it in her face. Then, not panic, not yet, but calculation, the kind that tries to find a way out even as the walls close in. And then the second layer hit, the access road. The utilities, the infrastructure feeding those cabins, all traced back across a line that now belonged to me, which meant even the units outside the direct overlap were dependent on land they did not control. And the implications unfolded without anyone needing to spell them out. Commercial activity tied to disputed property, revenue generated under misaligned jurisdiction, liability extending beyond just the physical structures. And I stayed where I was, hands resting loosely, not reacting, because this was not my moment to speak. This was the moment where the system spoke for me. And when the final slide came up, a simple summary of findings with coordinates and measurements listed in clean rows, it did not feel dramatic. It felt final, like the conclusion had already been reached before anyone walked into the room. And as people started shifting in their seats, whispering, checking documents again as if the lines might move if they looked hard enough, I caught her glance once more, shorter this time, sharper, and there was no confusion left in it. Just the first real acknowledgement that what had been built was no longer hers to control. And as the meeting adjourned without raised voices or sudden movements, just signatures and next steps outlined in steady tones, I stood up with everyone else, blending into the quiet movement toward the exit. because there was nothing left to prove here, only what came next. And that was no longer about whether the cabins crossed the line. It was about what happens when something built on the wrong land still stands exactly where it is. The first time I stepped back onto that shoreline after the meeting, it did not feel like a return. It felt like a shift, like the land itself had quietly corrected something that had been out of place for months, and the cabins were still there, exactly where they had been, polished wood catching the late afternoon light, glass reflecting the lake in that same picture-perfect way. But the difference was no longer physical, it was legal, and that changes everything without moving a single board. And I walked past the entrance sign without stopping this time, past the gravel that no longer sounded foreign under my boots. And when I reached the first cabin, I did not hesitate. I took the key from my pocket, the same one that had turned so easily days ago, and I opened the door again, slower this time, letting the hinges speak in that low, familiar creak, and inside nothing had changed. Same furniture, same layout, same laminated welcome sheet sitting on the counter, only now the details read differently. The logo printed at the top, the contact number, the checkout time, all of it tied to something that had already started to unravel. And I stepped inside fully, closing the door behind me with a soft click that felt heavier than it should have, not because of force, but because of meaning, and I walked through each room without rushing, measuring space the way I always do, not with tape, but with presence, because ownership is not just about lines on paper, it is about how something fits when you stand inside it. And for the first time since I arrived, nothing felt out of place. Not the walls, not the windows, not even the view, because the view had always been mine. They had just built around it, and I moved to the back door, stepping out onto the deck where the water stretched out in front of me, calm, unchanged, reflecting the sky the same way it had when I was a kid, and I could see the other cabins from here, lined up in that same precise pattern, each one now part of a structure that no longer belonged to the people who built it. And that was the part they never planned for, because they assumed control. Came from construction, from permits, from appearance, but control comes from foundation, from where something actually stands, and I leaned against the railing, letting the wood press solid under my hands, grounding, real, and somewhere down the row I could hear voices, quieter now, less certain, conversations that had shifted from confidence to calculation, and I did not need to be part of them, because the next steps had already been set in motion: reassessment notices, liability reviews, title corrections, processes that move slowly but do not stop once they begin, and each one of those steps pointed to the same conclusion. Structures built across a corrected boundary do not disappear, they transfer, and the paperwork that follows does not ask who built them. It asks where they stand. And I took a slow breath, letting the lake air settle in, because this was the moment where everything aligned: the dock, the coordinates, the lines on those maps that had been drawn long before any of this existed, all of it leading here, not to a fight, not to a confrontation, but to a result that did not need noise to be real. And I pulled the welcome sheet off the counter when I stepped back inside, folding it once, carefully, before setting it aside, because it was not needed anymore. Not in the way it had been intended. And as I walked back out, closing the door behind me with that same quiet click, I realized something simple that made me pause just long enough to look across all 17 cabins one more time. They thought they built a business on my land, but what they actually built was a portfolio I never paid to construct. And now every single one of those doors, every deck, every window facing this water, all of it stood exactly where it needed to be for one reason: because it was already mine. And I did not have to take anything from them. I just had to let the truth catch up to what they had already finished.